After last night's deadly bombing at a Manchester arena, you may be feeling a grim sense of déjà vu. Extremist attacks on soft targets are always shocking, but they no longer really surprise. So if this is the new normal, how should we cope? Glenn Carl specialized in terror threats during 23 years in the CIA. He joins us from Boston. And Stephanie Carvin is a terrorism expert at Carleton University. She's in Ottawa tonight. Well, Glenn, let me start with you, and let me back up just a sec, make sure we're all on the same page here. Are we in the new normal now with these attacks on soft targets?
Well, I would say that we are, and we have been for a good number of years, probably a decade or more, really. The CIA and other intelligence services globally have for a long time, although there's a heated debate in-house and in academia still, but nonetheless, for over a decade have assessed that the evolution of the terrorist threat will be to dispersed jihadists or terrorists, people who are not under the close command and control and acting as a member of Al-Qaeda, but as what we've started to call now inspired jihadists. These are individuals who, for a series of reasons, feel compelled to kill others in the name of Allah or some higher power. That's a harder problem to deal with than a coherent, traditional, hierarchical organization like Al-Qaeda.
So, Stephanie, do you agree we just have to accept that this is the world we live in now?
Well, it's not a happy message, but it certainly seems to be probably a realistic one. I would suggest that the bottom line with violent extremists is that they're opportunistic. And, you know, as just discussed, the fact is that violent extremists will, whether hierarchical or networked, and increasingly it is networked, they will always try to go for targets. You know, you can harden one, you can then, you know, they'll go for a soft target. You can try and harden that target. They will go after another one. So it's a series of trying to balance exactly what the threat information you have is and trying to come up with reasonable responses while trying to preserve open access in a democracy.
Well, let's talk about what it's like then for citizens within that democracy, within society. How do we shift our thinking given this new normal? What would you say to that, Stephanie?
Well, I think, you know, we have seen that to a certain extent, certainly in the UK, where there has been a stiff upper lip kind of mentality. I was in the UK in July 2005 when the attacks occurred there, and the resilience of the population is truly astounding. People got on with their lives. The next day they were going to work. And we've seen that here in Canada as well, following the attacks in October 2014. Canadians, by and large, got on with their lives. They weren't intimidated, and I think that's relatively encouraging. We can be shocked and we can mourn, but I think there's an understanding we do have to carry on with our lives.
Glenn?
I think that's exactly right. Ironically, I was also in London at the same time and have always been struck by the British response of stiff upper lip, and it's the proper way to respond. When the IRA blew up 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister's office, during Margaret Thatcher's Prime Minister's tenure, after an hour or two after that, the Foreign Minister, Sir Geoffrey Howe, came out and was interviewed, and he was asked, well, what did you do? And his response was, well, we finished our meeting, of course. And that's really the way to do this. The problem, the challenge for media and for citizens is that we respond viscerally, emotionally to what we see and what is frightening. And of course one will be frightened by the horrors of Manchester or of Ottawa or the other places, and then emotionally attributes a greater level of threat than in fact is the case. The true threat from terrorism in Western societies is infinitesimally small. It's real. It calls for the likes of CIA officers or CSIS officers to pursue it, but it is not an existential challenge that is at the end of every country lane or city street.
Let me talk to you about how governments and you know, police forces try to combat terrorism now. You know the old saying about the army generals tend to fight the last battle, not the one that's in front of them. Are anti-terrorism forces fighting the old battle against the kind of groups that they see now in the field, or have they adjusted? There is a sense that they're using the tactics you know, they use the tactics that the last terrorist attack showed, as opposed to thinking ahead. Stephanie?
Right. I think there's always going to be the risk of cognitive bias when you are engaged in any kind of countering activity. You're going to have in mind often what was just right in front of you. And I think that has, to a certain extent, been a problem. Terrorism today in 2017 is not what it was on September 12th, 2001. And we have had trouble sometimes recognizing when shifts take place. So, for example, when Al-Qaeda franchised, we had to respond to that in the mid-2000s. And around 2010, 2011, we had to understand kind of the mass movement nature of the Islamic State and adjust to that. But I think we are good at adjusting and eventually learning from our mistakes. We, you know, in Western societies, in Australia, in Britain, in America, and Canada, we do tend to review what went wrong and to produce lessons learned reports. Unfortunately, in Canada, we have tended not to make those reports public, which I think is unfortunate. But other countries have, and they seem to be determined to learn, and I think that's encouraging.
Glenn, are other forces, whether it's in the States or the UK, are they learning? Have they changed in the way they're dealing with these threats?
Well, both the sensible, or actually the effective response and the less effective response have played out and been used simultaneously and continue to be. Unfortunately, or not surprisingly, it becomes a political issue. So there is a strong inclination to use paramilitary special forces, paramilitary officers from the intelligence services to go and get the bad guys. We've seen this quite a bit by American counterterrorism efforts for the past 15 years. There are people who need to be stopped, but that should not be, and I would say the intelligence services on the whole, globally and in America, recognize that that should not be the central way forward. The way to deal with the problem long term is intelligence and police work. It's the local cop on the beat talking to the imam and the grocer who know the people in the neighborhood and see that Glenn has changed his behavior in the last several months. At the same time, you do intelligence work rather than kinetic, which sounds bloodless.
But haven't we been doing that? Haven't we been doing that for the last 10 or 15 years?
Oh, we have, and there have been. When you look at the numbers of terrorist attacks, despite the fear-mongering, frankly, of many politicians, there have been very few terrorist attacks. They are appalling. Not one is acceptable, and all need to be stopped. And we do not succeed in stopping all of them. But on the whole, there have been few, and the intelligence services in the West are quite adept on and take generally the correct approach, which is try to identify people and know when they will act. Now, on this Manchester attack, once again, the British services knew about this individual. The challenge for all services, and we don't have a good answer to this problem, is when to know, to identify that an individual of concern will become operational. That's the critical question, which we sometimes tragically get wrong.
Stephanie, Glenn makes a good point about, you know, when you look at the number of attacks, as awful as they are, they're not a lot of attacks when you start to add them all up, as opposed to parts in the world where terror attacks are almost daily, certainly weekly, with awful results. And we in the international media tend to kind of gloss over it or sometimes not even mention them. Are there things to learn from watching what we've seen, whether it's in Iraq or Pakistan or elsewhere, where we have seen daily occurrences of large-scale terror attacks?
You know, I think the context in the Middle East is radically different from what's happening in Canada. And in fact, I actually would say the context of what's happening in London and Manchester is also different from what's happening in Canada. The European context, the threat environment is different. So there's always lessons we can learn. And certainly, you know, there's good exchange of threat information from allies and as well as best practices. The Five Eyes countries get together and they talk about policies with regards to counterterrorism, not just from an intelligence sharing side, but actually from a policy side. So what can we actually learn together? I would say that there isn't that much we can necessarily learn from the Middle East, if only because, you know, Canada's a democracy. It has relatively low levels, as has been previously mentioned. And, you know, actually, if anything, I think we as Canadians have a lot to offer countries in the Middle East with regards to supporting counterterrorism initiatives. And we've seen that as a part of the Government of Canada's strategy, as a part of its global campaign to fight ISIS.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there for tonight, but I thank you both, Glenn in Boston, Stephanie in Ottawa. Thank you.